Revolutionary greetings. Haki Shakur coming back at you once again on another great day of resistance. On this day, September 11th, 1851, 9/11, 1851. I'm going to be talking to you today about one of the greatest self-defense resistance movements, day of self-defense slave rebellion in history that changed the course of history on this day, September 11th, 1851, man. And I'm going to be talking about this great ancestor, New African freedom fighter, William Parker, someone who is not really known. His story is not really known, except amongst the few people who are, in tune with history, our story, New African history. This great freedom fighter, William Parker, somebody that I wanted to honor and commemorate and venerate on this great day of resistance in our history as a New African people here in the Empire of the United States of America. I had to touch on this topic. I've been wanting to touch on this topic for the last couple of years, so I feel like today was the right time to really do it. So, yeah, man, let's get into it. A lot of people, a lot of African black people in America and across the world never heard of this. Self-defense slave rebellion is what I call it. And it's all predicated on one of the greatest self-defense resistance movements and self-defense advocates and freedom fighters of that time, and even in our history period here in North America, which is William Parker. William Parker, man, let me get right into it. The Christiana Resistance movement, self-defense slave rebellion. A lot of whitewashed pseudo historians like to call it the Christiana riots, or the Christiana riots, excuse me, because over the years, white historians like to label our resistance and insurrections and rebellions as riots, like it's something abnormal. It's something that we wasn't supposed to do. So I really don't like to get too caught up in that terminology of riots. Even though, the oppressed and the dispossessed people do riot when they're pushed to the edge. But when we're, putting out our story and calculating our story and putting out the proper storyline of our rebellions, we got to put it in the proper context of terms, which is these are slave revolutions, slave rebellions, slave resistance, slave self-defense. You feel me? I feel more, comfortable with using those terminologies because that's what they were. They were slave rebellions and slave revolutions of those time periods to get our people free and to smash the capitalist system of slavery. William Parker, let me focus on him real quick because I don't want to make this video too long. William Parker was an escaped, enslaved African who escaped. He was a mulatto. He was mixed. His father was a white man. His mother was a New African sister, He was from Anne Arundel County, Maryland. He escaped slavery, where he escaped slavery from Maryland and escaped into Pennsylvania because, Pennsylvania was the free state where enslaved Africans could escape to. So this whole Christiana rebellion is predicated, on what we call the Mason-Dixon line, the end of the Black Belt, because some of the Black Belt stretch from the deeper south into Washington, D.C. and a little tip of Maryland. But this rebellion I call is the, resistance at the Mason-Dixon line, because this is where this basically took place. Lancaster, Pennsylvania, Christiana, Pennsylvania. And this great freedom fighter escaped from slavery when he was young and escaped into Pennsylvania to freedom. And once he got into Pennsylvania, this great brother didn't just escape for his self-interest. He kept his people in mind. So that's why you got to venerate great people like William Parker, is that he didn't forget his people once he escaped the capitalist system of slavery. He set up, once he got there, another escaped slave by the name of Lisa was his wife. Always got to throw the sisters in there because the sisters have always been a part of our resistance movements. I can't leave the sisters out. They are so important. This sister, along with two other escaped enslaved Africans who escaped to Christiana back in 1839, along with William Parker and his wife, set up one of the greatest self-defense resistance movements in the history of our struggle here in North America, which is the Christiana resistance movement. They set up this movement. It became a part of the Underground Railroad. Once they established the Underground Railroad, which was already established in Pennsylvania, it was over like 50-something safe houses in Pennsylvania in this time period. So this was another added community, black self-determined community, who set up a resistance self-defense unit and movement to help other ancestors escape from Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, and other southern states to make it. Once they make it to Pennsylvania, they had a place to stay, and they would be defended, and they would remain free. So they set up this self-defense movement in Christiana, which brings in Christiana, Maryland, around the time of between the 1840s and the 1850s, to be for a chronology of when this was set up. So they set up this self-defense unit. And also, let me remind you, William Parker also knew the great Frederick Douglass. He knew Frederick Douglass. They knew each other from slavery because they all was from Maryland. And he escaped into Maryland also. Escaped into Pennsylvania, saying when Frederick Douglass escaped slavery also. So they knew each other from slavery. Also, William Parker would later on meet up with Frederick Douglass once again after they escaped slavery, and I'm gonna get to that in a few seconds. Let me get right into what transpired on this day, 9/11, in Christiana, Pennsylvania, and I call it it's a Maryland and Pennsylvania slave rebellion because it ties into it together like that, like I said, with the Mason-Dixie line. And let me get right into what happened on this date. Also, let me remind you, let me say this, let me throw this in real quick. Around this time period, it was this slave unit. It was a slave unit, slave catchers, slave patrollers called the Gap Gang from Pennsylvania. They play an intricate role in the storyline. The Gap Gang of Gap, Pennsylvania. This is where Gap, Pennsylvania come from. And these white slave patrollers play a major role in why William Parker and all of them set up this safe house in Christiana, Pennsylvania, to defend Africans from this gang called the Gap Gang, a white terrorist gang who used to capture enslaved Africans to sell them back to the deeper South for profits. So they also set this up because to defend themselves from the slave catchers of Pennsylvania and Maryland. So let me just put that out there. And let me get right into it. Let me also state for the record why this slave resistance movement, this slave rebellion is so important is the fact that this slave rebellion that took place on September 11, 1851 is the main slave rebellion, self-defense rebellion that smashed the system of and law of the Fugitive Slave Law 1850 that came in effect from the southern states in the northern states, the Slave Fugitive Act of 1850, 1851. This destroyed the Slave Fugitive Act of 1851 when this rebellion took place. So let me just put that out there for the record. And let me get right into what happened. It was a slave owner from Baltimore County, Maryland, by the name of Edward Gorsuch. I don't really want to speak his name too much because we don't like to give too much, praise to our oppressors and enemies. So I don't want to say his name too much. But Edward Gorsuch was a farmer, slave plantation owner in Baltimore County, Maryland. This whole thing is predicated around some of his enslaved Africans who escaped off of his plantation earlier that year. Okay, let me set up the timeline. I do believe it was in November. Let me see. Let me get right to it. Yes, November 7th, 1849. 4 enslaved Africans by the name of Noah Booley, Nelson Ford, George Hammond, and Joshua Hammond, the Hammond brothers, escaped from Edward Gorsuch's plantation on November 7th, 1849. They escaped to Maryland, got to Christiana, and was protected by William Parker and his self-defense movement. I do believe like a year later, and this goes again to all these informants that are always helping the white man try to keep new African people in their place and to keep us in slavery. By the word of a informant in August 28th, 1851, Gorsuch got word from an informant that some more of his slaves and a lot of his slaves had escaped into Pennsylvania and was hiding in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, Christiana, Pennsylvania. Over 3,000 Africans lived in this area in Christiana, Pennsylvania, who had escaped slavery and who also were free blacks who had already made it to that area and were given freedom and were living as free blacks, free new Africans in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. So this area was a safe haven of self-determination, self-defense, and freedom for our people. Lancaster to Christiana, Pennsylvania, because I want y'all to do y'all research on that. This was a self-determined political, self-governed communities of new African black people. So to put that in context, you feel me? So he got word, Edward Gorsuch and some of the slave patrollers from Maryland headed towards Christiana and Lancaster to get his enslaved Africans back, to get these Africans, escaped Africans back. And so once he got into Pennsylvania, he also got aid and help from, here go the police, Philadelphia police, you feel me, assisted him and tried to, they got together and they headed towards William Parker's land, because William Parker had land in Pennsylvania. So they headed towards this property. Once they got to this property, Alicia, William Parker's wife, alerted. Well, let me get back to how William Parker got alerted. William Parker got alerted by the great William Steele, who operated the Underground Railroad in Pennsylvania. He's a legend. William Steele of the Underground Railroad alerted William Parker that they were coming to raid his land and to take back escaped Africans and to take them back to the deeper South into slavery. William Parker was already on point and already alerted, but as they got closer, another escaped slave seen Edward Gorsuch in these slave patrols heading towards the land. He ran, alerted William Parker. Once they got closer, Alicia the shootout takes place. The shootout begins. Like I'm saying, we will shoot back. New Africans will shoot back. The shootout begins. Alicia Parker alerted. They had a system set up where she would sound the alarm, sound the horn, and other free Africans and escaped Africans would come to the aid, and they would come defend the land of William Parker. When she sounded the alarm, over 150 enslaved Africans got to the land, got to William Parker's house, set up a defense unit, started shooting at Edward Gorsuch and all these Philadelphia police and Maryland slave patrollers. So the great shootout transpires. As the shootout transpired, Edward Gorsuch and his son were shot down in self-defense by these great ancestors. He was murdered. And several other slave patrollers were murdered and wounded and sent into retreat as William Parker and these great ancestors, as the shootout transpired, they had to escape. They could no longer stay on the land. So William Parker escaped with several other enslaved Africans, escaped to Rochester, New York, where he again would meet up with Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass then aided William Parker and these other escaped slaves to get free to Canada. So they later escaped to Canada, which is where he eventually landed. I do believe it's called Buxton County, off of the Niagara River in Canada. It was a settlement called Buxton, Canada. This was also another self-governed New African black community that was eventually being set up as William Parker and his family and others escaped to Buxton, where they would later set up this great independent New African community, where he would later on continue his work with the Underground Railroad. And he also became a part of the North Star, the great North Star paper that was started by Frederick Douglass. And also, I do believe, I can't think of his name right now, but the other great ancestor who was a freedom fighter also was a part of the North Star. I can't think his name right now. But yes, they escaped to Buxton. And when they got to Buxton, they set up this independent community where they would later continue to help enslave Africans who escaped North America and escaped into Canada. So this is a great story that you should research and look up. And also, Philadelphia tried to indict these great ancestors. They indicted 41 New African ancestors who were a part of this great resistance movement and rebellion and self-defense on that day. They indicted them with 41 to over 117 counts of indictments to try to convict these great ancestors that were later later would not stick, because William Parker and these other great ancestors that already escaped to Canada, and they was not coming back to North America or Philadelphia or Pennsylvania to be charged and thrown back into slavery or put into prison the rest of their lives. So once they escaped, that was it. The Philadelphia court threw out all charges. All these great ancestors were acquitted. And that was the end of that great resistance of 9/11, the Christiana Resistance movement on this great day today here in 2019. So I just want to give salutations to William Parker. Go look up his story. One of our great freedom fighters of all time, William Parker, who also was a farmer. He was a farmer, abolitionist, who had land. Another key lesson I want you to always learn is that these great ancestors always fought for land, self-governance, political power, and control over their lives. That is the history. That is the New African story here in North America. So do your research on the Christiana Resistance movement and the Christiana self-defense slave rebellion. I'm going to sign off on this note, man. I mean, what more can I say, man? Another great story of our story of the New African nation. I'm gonna sign off on that note. Excuse me. Haki, Shakur, free the land by any means necessary.